So welcome to the WAPPP Round Table on capturing PPP opportunities in philanthropy. My name is Jean-Christophe Barth, and I'm the Executive Director of the World Association of PPP Units and Professionals, the voice of the public-private partnership professionals industry. It's exciting for me to see this session happening for a number of reasons. First, we're creating public-private partnerships that deliver value for future generations. And I think this is really important to ensure long-term performance and that we also start using PPPs as a tool for development. We need all hands on deck for that, so we don't leave anyone behind. Second, I see a role for philanthropies to share their experience and network to help projects become bankable, thereby converting classical PPPs more into smart public-private philanthropic initiatives that lead the way for larger scale replication to accelerate the closing of the massive infrastructure gap that we have. And third, this is also very exciting to me to have Max van Abendroth, the former executive director of the European umbrella organization of philanthropies, Daphne, who now chairs this brand new WAPPP forum, Philanthropy and PPPs. I wish him all the best for this new forum initiative, and having seen how diligently it's all been prepared, I'm very confident that we'll be able to really make a difference with this. I'm also pleased to see that many of you have joined this kickoff with the representatives of WINGS, which is our sister organization in the world of philanthropies, and the Laudes Foundation, that are both so kind to support this new WAPPP initiative. Allow me to share a couple of webinar technicalities with you and present the sequence of events for the next 90 minutes. So we're planning, as you may have seen, to record this session, and we'll finish at 4 o'clock sharp, European time, obviously. The replay will be made available on the WAPPP YouTube channel afterwards. It's called Next Level PPPs. Please use the chat box for any questions, so that we can collect the queries and the panel and guide a bit what the panel then needs to also cover. And we'll try to respond on all the points. And if we're not able, we'll try to give written answers later. But I think this is the best way to make useful use of our time together. We're also planning to have a couple of breakout rooms to keep this lively. We're planning 2 rounds of breakups to allow you to get to know each other better. And also we invite you to switch on your cameras for that so that the participants can benefit from building this community together. I'm now introducing to you the new chair of the Philanthropy and PPPs Forum, Max van Abendroth. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Jean-Christophe. It's fantastic to be here and to see you all attending this meeting. Lots of familiar faces, but also quite many new faces. Still a lot of Max van Abendroth, as I can see. So maybe there is something that everyone can just do who joins and is still titled as Max van Abendroth, to change it to your own name. Yeah, I'm really delighted to be here in this role of sharing the Philanthropy and PPPs Forum at WAPPP. And I'd like to welcome you with a brief personal impression that I took away from the OECD Net Forward meeting on Monday and Tuesday this week in Paris, where around 40 foundations from across the world met who are active in international development. And there were 3 points that kind of stuck with me after this meeting. So first of all, in the face of the multiple crises that we are facing, we are all together in the business of building a resilient world for people and planet. The second point, we can achieve this. In order to achieve this, we need to break out of our silos and acknowledge that everything is interconnected. Climate crisis, the polarization of societies, and also the rising social inequalities. And this requires a systems view. And the third point, very important, I think, for us here today is to be really effective, we need to work in partnerships with local expertise, with blended finance, with innovative methods, and to be more than the sum of all our parts. And this is a bit the kind of the mantra for the session today, and also for the community we are trying to form here as part of the Philanthropies for PPP Forum. And in order to achieve that, we can really create value for future generations. We need every one of us to play a role. And the meeting today is really set up to identify how can every single person here in this room contribute to this goal. Today, we start a new chapter by coming together. So I really would like that every one of you takes away from this meeting at least 2 new contacts, people you haven't seen before and you think they're relevant for your work, and 2 new ideas that inspire you for your work. And that's why we designed the session in an interactive way. Jean-Christophe already mentioned that before, and I hope that you will enjoy that. So let me just see how we want to run this program. So we will have some elements interactive, then we will have presentations from 2 people representing the PPP field and the philanthropy field, respectively, to bring us up to speed on what these sectors are about. And then I'm really happy that we have Leslie Johnston with us for an inspirational keynote to really give us some ideas how this multi-stakeholder collaboration for collective impact can work out. So now to start with this, I'd like to invite all of you to answer a poll that we prepared. This will happen here on screen. And the idea is to understand a little better who is in the room. So Jean-Christophe, maybe you can launch the first question.
I see active participation already. So right now, philanthropy is leading the game. But I see that others, private sector, is also catching up. Please all participate in the poll so we can have meaningful numbers.
Very good. Great to have you all. I hope you had a good moment together in the smaller breakouts to get to know each other and get a bit of a sense who is in the room. And now I'd like to really go into the substance of what brings us together today. And it is my big pleasure to introduce to you Jyoti Bisbey. Jyoti is a member of the executive committee of WAPPP. Jyoti is leading on infrastructure finance, SDGs, ESG, and PPPs. And she's a global expert with more than 20 years of experience in leading green infrastructure finance and public-private partnerships in developing countries. She has worked for the World Bank Group and the United Nations with developing countries and supporting governments on public investment pipelines, preparing PPP projects, and financing the decarbonization of infrastructure. So Jyoti is a great person to connect the 2 worlds. And over to you, Jyoti, to introduce to us the PPP world.
All right, thank you so much, Max, Jean-Christophe, and everyone. I got to meet 2 very defined ladies in my breakout room, Carolina and a person from Poland, actually. Very interesting experience. So, looking forward to actually continue working with them. So here I am. I want to just start off this discussion for just to kind of give a 101 on PPPs. And as part of that, I want to cover three topics and very quickly. So it's almost like a week's worth of PPP 101 in 7 minutes. So, so just bear with me. And if you have any questions, of course, this is just the beginning of the conversation. So, what is a PPP? I think we need to take a step back and see where does PPP actually fit, right? PPP is connected to infrastructure, and we all know infrastructure life cycle is actually quite big. Sorry, apologize. I didn't actually start my my presentation mode. So the infrastructure life cycle actually starts at the planning stage, where it leads to an investment decision, whether that particular infrastructure is needed for the benefit of the society. And that investment decision leads to preparation of that particular project. And as a result, then we see a lot of feasibility studies and also whole life cycle cost analysis, which leads to a procurement decision, in the government. And that decision kind of leads to whether it can be procured through public funds and through public agencies doing the work, or through the private sector, which is a PPP. So at the procurement stage, once the decision is made that this project is better procured as a public-private partnership, then that leads to a financing strategy. Should they go to the market to raise the financing for this particular project? Do they do a private deal? Do they go to capital markets to issue a bond? So you know, a lot of thinking goes behind on how they actually approach the market outside of the public agencies, which is the traditional mode of procuring these services. And that decision kind of leads to commercial close and financial close of the project once the private sector has actually signed the contract. And that leads to the asset management strategy decision, because it's a public project, how to design it, construct it, O&M, and handover, because the government's role does not end in a PPP. It continues till the end of the contract cycle. Now, where does PPP stand? PPP, actually, the project which we are talking about, and most of the discussion is actually focused on the last two stages, which is the procurement and the implementation. And as you can see, the previous stages are quite important, and actually they're quite long in a developing country, especially. Now, what is a definition of a PPP? Actually, there is no perfect definition of a PPP. There is no standard. So there are a couple of principles which have to be there in any kind of definition of a public-private partnership. One, it has to be a long-term contract. There has to be a transfer of risk from the public sector to the private sector. And third, the payment has to be linked to the performance, what the project is generating, and how is that performance being captured as part of a unitary payment to the private party. So, and a public-private partnership project can be a user pay. That means the consumers, the users who are benefiting from the project, can actually pay and generate enough revenue to pay back the project, or it can be a government pay project where you will see traditionally an availability payment, sort of a project where the government is actually paying for service. Beneficiary, of course, remains the users and the consumers, but the actual revenue is being paid by the government. Now, the distinction, we all need to understand, PPP is not same as privatization. There are two very different things. So what can the private sector do? And you can see what we call a DBFOM on the left side of the screen. So private sector can design, it can build or upgrade or renovate the infrastructure. It can finance the capital investment. It can operate and maintain. And on the right side, you can see different roles the private sector actually plays in the project company. These are the different types of contracts. As we go from left to right, more risk is transferred to the private party. So on the far left, you see utility restructuring and civil works. That's a traditional public procurement project. And to the far right, you see the full divestiture, which is a privatization. But in the middle, you have this combination of a partnership between a public sector agency, public agency, and a private company, which could be a management and O&M contract, lease contract, concessions, BOTs, DBFOM, joint ventures. So those are the ones which we call public-private partnerships. Now, this is a very, very typical project finance spider chart, which we use in PPPs. The center of it all is always a project company. This is a project finance model, not a corporate finance model, where a special purpose vehicle is actually set up for that particular infrastructure. And that company becomes a center to bring the financiers, lenders, equity investors, and if a philanthropy a fund is actually putting money in it, so that's how they will come. And then there's a granting authority. And then on one side is the end user who is purchasing. For example, if it's a power generation plant, then it's probably a public company which is actually has signed a PPA, public power purchase agreement with the project company. And then you also have at the bottom suppliers for the fuel, for the raw materials, and then you have subcontractors, construction, O&M generally is if it's a concessionaire will probably subcontract it to a separate EPC contractor, and then have an operator. Now the big question is, the discussion for today is, where does philanthropy fit in this spider chart? Now the blue writing over here highlights the risks, main risks. Of course, there's the risk management is a bread and butter for PPPs, but these just highlights the main risks for each of the stakeholder here. And what it means is, if a stakeholder is part of a PPP, that also means that they have to, in a major way, think about these risks. Now, what does the landscape look like for PPPs in developing countries, which is the low and middle income countries? So this data is from PPI database. As you can see, actually the amount of investment has gone down. And it has kind of stagnated. 2020, of course, was an outlier. It was low, but still, it is quite significant. It was not. It was, the deals were still being committed. So what I think going forward, and we keep talking about, and Max and JC and Jean-Christophe said in their opening, how can we mobilize the private sector to really help in this development agenda? But the reality says that it's actually going down. Now, which sectors are more common? Economic infrastructure. That's where most of the private sector money goes in developing countries. So the bottom blue is energy sector, and the yellow is transport. So traditionally, we have seen PPPs mostly in the energy sector, in generation mostly. But lately, energy sector is kind of going down, and transport has become the majority of PPPs. It's actually almost 60% of the investment committed in 2021. So what is really happening is the energy sector, most of these projects are renewable, they're smaller, they're more spread out. And in transport, the big projects are really becoming PPP projects. You have roads, you have airports and railways. And that's where you also see the emissions. For example, transport emissions in developing countries, the rate of increase is actually higher than the energy sector. Now, where are these projects? They are the top region remains the East Asia and Pacific region. And then we have the Latin America region. And then we have the Europe and Central Asia. And then we have the South Asia. Countries have remained pretty much the same in the past 10 years. This is China, Brazil, India, Vietnam, Indonesia, Turkey. Lately, we have begun to see new entrants. For example, Uzbekistan is on the map. We see Congo, South Africa. We see more projects, Bulgaria, Ukraine. So, new countries are coming, but it's still dominated by the top 5 countries. Now, this last chart is very interesting, especially for this webinar. Where is the investment coming from? So 53% is actually domestic in developing countries. So that is a very, that tells you how philanthropy can actually work at the country level with the domestic financiers and operators and companies to mobilize more financing. So 45% is foreign, and that foreign is coming, 11% is Germany, Japan, Switzerland, and UAE. So it's quite interesting. And I think that also that the cross-section, if we see a lot of the funds are actually coming from European side. And I saw in the survey that a lot of you are actually coming from Europe as well. Now, the last question is, so how can philanthropy really work in PPPs? I think my one message is the fundamental project viability issues remain. It doesn't matter who's the financier, how they are financing it. The project itself has to be a viable project. So the fundamental investment decision, that was the first step, if you remember, on the infrastructure life cycle, that has to be really the core. And that combines the policy, the planning, the programming, and the fundamental governance issues as part of this project. And that's what we call a bankable project. If the project is not solid to begin with, then it's really difficult to bring any outside party to really finance and put money on the table. So what are the possibilities for philanthropy fund? I think there are many, and they're numerous, and I think we are just beginning to see where philanthropy can actually add value in terms of public services to the users. So of course, we know the blended finance, the patient capital. It can enter on the public side, it can enter on the private and user side. And actually one of the speakers said that he doesn't know which bracket he fits in. I think that's a classic example, and the flexibility of a philanthropy fund, that it can actually support different stakeholders. The funds can be given as grants, as loans, and as equity. Can it scale up? So scaling, fill financing gaps, that's one of the objectives I think we're going to hear about. And of course, achieving impact, I think that's the main goal of philanthropy. And that's what PPPs should be kind of looking for. However, so modalities are not clear. As you saw from the spider chart, I think this is what we need to work on from WAPP. And now that we have the new chapter under Max, I think this is our kind of the next step. What are the modalities for philanthropy fund to really enter into a PPP? How can it actually catalyze more institutional investors? Systemic change requires scaling, not those the small project, once in a while pilot projects, but we need to scale them up so that we can have long-term engagement and also help the reform process, because just financing is not going to replace the reform of the sector, of the program, and of the government. So the value and impact proposition needs to be clear. Every philanthropy fund is set up very differently for a very different purpose. I think we need to kind of streamline and bring some kind of standardization in the understanding. And that's what I think we are going to work on through this chapter. So risk and return go hand in hand. What is that particular fund willing to, how much risk and what kind of risk they're willing to take, because that's what defines a return. And of course, very important in developing countries, is it actually subsidizing the inefficiencies in the project, which actually crowds out commercial financing? And that is also the debate for development financing, for example. So, so that is a very fine balance, which we need to consider. Timing and risk, whether it can enter in the development phase. You have at planning, preparing, and procuring. So a lot of the R&D, for example, we see more and more philanthropy funds actually helping the government to develop the first two stages of that infrastructure project cycle, which you saw in the first slide. Construction, which is the capital cost, implementation, payment subsidy, whether it can go directly to the users and help them to pay for services, ancillary service. So there's a big infrastructure project, but then there are smaller projects which kind of are attached to that one. Can philanthropy help with those projects? And handover, this is actually a paper which Max sent me from the UK, that there is actually a discussion of philanthropy being used for exit mobilization of other financiers from a project. So whether it can fund, whether it's a small fund, whether it can actually fund big infrastructure projects in economic infrastructure or social infrastructure. SDGs or ESG, it's a very, as we know, they're not the same. And I think the market is still trying to understand how to align SDGs with ESG. So how do you actually measure, what you're trying to achieve? What is the impact you're looking for? And leverage. Leverage means like how much public money you have and how much commercial financing you brought into the project, but that does not mean it actually brings impact. So that I think we need to keep in mind, especially for philanthropy fund. And how many positive, negative, no, how many positive environment social externalities the project can bring. I think that's going to be a key to philanthropy fund, and affordability both at the fiscal level and at the user level. And is philanthropy fund willing to take the first loss? Because that's the key question. If you see for COP27, for everybody is saying that development financing should take the first loss on climate losses, for example. Can philanthropy play a role in that? So with that, I will end my presentation and hand it over back to
Jyoti. Two questions came in the chat, really interesting. One from Mohammed Suleiman, who says, I think the more pressing need for philanthropy funding is the social sector PPPs, e.g. healthcare PPPs, wildlife conservation, etc., right? And another that is in the similar direction, as a foundation representative, I'm missing topics like social service provision or work in education formation as examples of PPPs, especially in trying to innovative approaches to social challenges as a way also to engage with the public sector in changing and developing social policies. Maybe you could address that?
Yes, I think these are very relevant questions. And I think that's why I put that as however, because we do not have enough evidence on how philanthropy can make a difference in social infrastructure. How big are they? How do they get involved? At which point of that PPP spider chart, you know, and what kind of risks the philanthropy funds are taking. Like I said, field of philanthropy is so widespread right now, and it's increasing every day. Somebody somewhere right now is setting up a foundation. Somebody somewhere right now is thinking how I can make a difference because I have so much money lying around. But we need to, you know, I mean, I think every new kind of an entrant in this field and development financing goes, I think we are at a very nascent stage right now. And if we want to bring some kind of mainstreaming and standardization, so philanthropy can be seen as a main street player, then we need to kind of convert some of these modalities into common understanding.
Thank you very much, Jyoti. And also, I have to apologize that we can't take more questions now. This is really just the beginning of diving into the space. And we would like to give also the opportunity for the philanthropy side to introduce itself to this community. And then, of course, really looking forward to Leslie's intervention. But before going there, thank you, Jyoti. The presentation will be shared with the participants, if I understood correctly. So that's good that we have this information at hand. Over to Benjamin. Benjamin Bellegy, the CEO of the global umbrella organization for philanthropy, WINGS, is a French national living in Brazil. And Benjamin used to work for NGOs and cooperation agencies in Africa and the Fondation de France. WINGS itself is hosting the global philanthropy for climate movement and is driving force behind multi-stakeholder collaboration for collective impact. Thank you, Benjamin, for taking your time to be here and give us a better understanding of what philanthropy is about. Over to you.
Thanks a lot, Max, and great to see you chairing this important new initiative. And thanks also, Jyoti. I think it was really a very useful presentation to get a very concrete understanding of what we're talking about and identifying some of the gaps also into mainstreaming these kind of collaborations, which might happen here and there, but are still nascent, as you were saying. I will take a step back slightly in my remarks. I'm going to speak more broadly about the importance for philanthropy to collaborate with other actors for development. But before sharing a few thoughts on that front, just mentioning for those of you who are not familiar with WINGS, we're indeed, as Max said, we're a global network, a global umbrella organization that brings together about 200 members in 60 countries, who themselves are either philanthropic networks, advisories, support organizations that really help donors, foundations, and other philanthropic actors to have more impact and also to have a better enabling environment to operate and to thrive. And so the big goal for us as a global network is to unlock the potential of philanthropy for systemic change, for the transformation of our societies. We do that in many different ways, but pushing for more multi-stakeholder collaboration within the field is one of the key aspects of that work. just a quick word about what we mean by philanthropy. And as Jyoti was mentioning, this is very spread world. This is very diverse sector. And the Wings network itself represents that diversity, which means that we have organizations that are working to support corporate foundations, for example. Others are helping more family foundations and ultra high net worth or high net worth individuals, while others are really helping communities themselves on the ground to raise assets, to manage assets for their own development, and everything in between. So it's a very complex world, but I agree that it's also a fast growth industry if we take it from the industry perspective. And today it's relatively small, but still quite significant, I think, in the development space. We still lack data. But from the data that we have, we estimate that there are about 200,000 foundations around the world, and they sit on $1.5 trillion in assets, and they distribute about 150 billion every year. Not everything is for development, but it's still important, and this is probably just a part of the sector, and there is probably more than that. That's from a Harvard report from a few years ago. When we look at the contribution of philanthropy to the SDGs, for example, and to development, we have different sets of numbers. One of them comes from the OECD that published twice a report about the contribution of philanthropy for development, and they estimate that the sector has contributed $42 billion between 2016 and 2019. So it's a little bit over 10 billion per year. And they estimate that 20% of that amount is coming from actually domestic local foundations. Again, that data is not complete. It's just giving an idea of maybe the top of the iceberg, a bit more than the top of the iceberg, but I personally think that there is much more that is under radar because we lack the infrastructure and the data to really see that. But as it was said, the issue there is that a lot of these resources and the important potential behind it are quite scattered and they're not really harnessed. And we also have another issue is that in the philanthropic sector, collaboration is not the natural inclination, unfortunately. It takes dialogue, it takes a little bit of push, it takes reckoning with the complexity and the depth of the issues we're facing. And I think that this is right now happening in our field. I can sense that there is a change in how our sector and foundations in their diversity are considering the importance of collaborating with each other, of course, but also and even maybe more importantly with other actors, including government, business, et cetera. And so that's the change we're trying to push. But today, it seems like the data we have also shows 60% of foundations do not collaborate. So there's really here a big role for networks like Wings and for our members to really encourage their constituencies to engage on the path for collaboration. And I was mentioning that there is, I think, change in this field, especially in the context of the pandemic that we're still facing, that we've just faced, the geopolitical instability, the climate emergency. I mean, these multiple crises are really, I think, challenging our field to think differently, not seeing its role simply as, a field that is going to help fill some gaps left by governments and markets here and there, but really help play a more transformational role. And transformation and systemic change take multi-actor collaboration, because philanthropy, even if we were to grow, and we know that the sector is growing, including in the global south, very fast, but it will still remain a drop in the ocean of the needs when we look at the SDG funding gap, which has, I think, doubled after the pandemic. It's just overwhelming. So the question is really how to unlock this potential, and in these multi-actor collaborations are absolutely critical to make that happen. So what it will take and what Wings is engaged in is trying to change the narrative and again make collaboration the norm in philanthropy, not the exception. That also means sharing successes, documenting how it looks like and the kind of forms it can take on the ground, and so that it inspires others to follow that. But it also takes an ecosystem. It also takes a philanthropic infrastructure and a collaboration infrastructure that is going to help plug these actors on the long term, because I think we should not have strictly a project-based view on this question of public-private partnerships. We need to see how we can create the bridges and the platforms on the long run, on the ground, and also, of course, globally informed and connected, to create these partnerships in an ongoing way, in a regular way, and to turn it into really mainstream. And that takes investments in infrastructure to simply have the opportunity, just like we're having now, to meet with each other, to know, oh, these actors are doing this. Well, there are actually foundations, there are networks of foundations in these regions that might be a good idea to get them around the same table and start identifying priorities, common areas, and using the SDGs as a common language and as a common frame, which has a lot of potential. And we've seen that, for example, in places like Kenya, where was created something called the SDG Philanthropy Platform, now called SDG Partnerships Platform. Then they've really managed to align tens of millions of dollars of investments from the business sector, government sector, and philanthropic sector around the SDGs, because they had that shared space to align and to create collaboration. So that will be a bit my call also for all of us to consider more investments in these infrastructure that help foster and generate this kind of partnerships. Another good example that we have from our members is right now in Argentina, the Association of Foundations, GDF, they're creating these kind of partnerships at the city level, and they've started roundtables in 10 cities. And for example, in Mendoza, in the region of Mendoza, they've managed to align around a goal on digital access for education. And according to the new investments that all these actors have decided to make together, they're planning to reduce the time to fill the gap that they're facing in this space from 7 years to 1 year, because they're really able to generate more resources and articulate them in a sort of common plan. So again, it takes having these players on the ground that bring actors together, and this should happen in an ongoing way. I completely support everything that was said about the specificities and the potential of the philanthropic capital. It's flexible, we can take risks, we can leverage our influence. So this is really where we can make a difference. And we have that proximity also with communities and with issues that can be leveraged for better quality of the project that Jyoti was talking about. And so I fully agree with the fact that there is here a big potential for philanthropy, not so much in terms of dollars, although it's not ridiculous, but it's still limited, but also and mainly in terms of the nature of that capital and the risk we can take. Yeah, I mean, I could mention other examples, and there are some new initiatives that are quite promising also in the climate space. And we referred to the fact that WING right now is hosting that collective commitment for philanthropy to engage in climate, and we see it's one of the areas where there's potential, and there are initiatives like the Global Energy Alliance for People and the Planet that is really going to help scale equitable energy transitions in low and middle income countries. And that's an initiative that involves Rockefeller Foundation, Bezos Earth Fund, IKEA Foundation, and also development banks, and other institutions. So I think we have momentum, we have capacity, but we need these investments in the infrastructure. We need to build the tools and the guidance also on how we can partner with each other, because we need similar language, we need to better understand each other, and that's something we're committed to support at WINGS. And we're excited to see that WAPPP is now creating this chapter, and we're looking forward to collaborating with you and connecting our respective members so that they can generate more and more of these collaborations on the ground. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you, Benjamin. I know it's a bit of a run through philanthropy from a global perspective, but it's amazing to have your input here and also the commitment to work closely together. Thank you. Now, I would like to move on to Leslie. I know Leslie is incredibly busy, so she has several things happening at the same time, but I'm so grateful that you are here. Leslie Johnston is the CEO of Laudes Foundation, a foundation that has been launched in 2020 to challenge and inspire industry and harness power for good. The Laudes Foundation is a very special foundation. I think it is one of these very few foundations that give strong impulses into the field. beyond the philanthropy sector to really introduce a different way of thinking about complex problems and solving them. And I think your vision and the way how you implemented, Leslie, has changed the discussions in boardrooms, at national governments and international forums like COP. So it's fantastic to have you here and hear a bit about your inspiration for this work that we are starting here to go ahead. Thank you, Leslie. Over to you.
Great. Thanks, Max. Wow. I'm very honored, and I'm not sure I deserve all that praise, but it's really great to be here. In fact, I was just saying in our little intro group, I didn't even know that WAPP existed until Max reached out to me. So I'm really glad that it exists, because I think it actually plays a really important role. So what I'd like to do is a couple things and really kind of build on the frame that Benjamin, lovely to see you, and thank you for your opening comments, because I do think there's a really exciting opportunity for philanthropy when it comes to public-private partnerships. And I want to actually start with a story, just because there is a story that has actually really shaped how I think and how I do things, choices I've made in my life, and what eventually led me to become the chief exec of Laudes Foundation. So bear with me, and I promise this is relevant. So about 17 years ago, I survived a plane crash on an island in northern Mozambique. I was 6 months pregnant with my first son, and he too survived. And I have to say, I love him dearly, but my God, he's a teenager now. And, you know, everything I say to him is mortifying, but that's another story. But the thing is, this was a small plane. It had trouble landing. It crash landed, it flipped over, it caught on fire. I couldn't get out of my seatbelt. I was hanging upside down, pregnant, trying to get out of the plane. It was absolutely terrifying. And what is really important here is I did get out. I did survive. In fact, everyone survived. And it was scary. And I didn't know if I was okay, if my son would be okay. But as a result of this experience, a couple things happened. And I think first and foremost, I have a really cool scar on my back, which is a plane crash scar. So that's pretty cool. It's something to talk about at parties. But second, and more importantly, I do think that this experience really helped me reevaluate my priorities. And I know it sounds a little cliched, but when you do have one of these kind of near-death experiences, you actually think, am I being as effective as I can be in what I want to do in life? You know, and for me, I was already working in purpose-driven work, you know, and can I be as impactful? You know, how can I maximize the impact that I have as an individual and with the organizations that I run? And third, and this is a very interesting outcome, is I became a risk taker. And I say that because I never really was a risk taker. And when I think about what does that mean? Well, to do great things and to do things like shift a system, you need to be brave and bold, and you need to stick your neck out, and you need to feel comfortable with uncertainty, and you need to thrive in ambiguity. And you need to accept the fact that the status quo is not good enough. And actually life is too short to accept the status quo. And that's how I ended up working in philanthropy. So bear with me, you'll see the link, because philanthropy is actually, and I'm sure many of you know this because you are also in philanthropy, one of the most exciting, flexible, and actually risk-seeking sources of capital out there. We can take risks as philanthropic funders. We can tackle market failures. We can show what could be. So really sort of challenge the imagination. And in the context of PPPs, we can pull others along. As Jyoti said, great examples there of how philanthropy can create incentives. It can remove barriers. It can bring together unlikely allies. Really important role. In fact, there was actually a great report that was done, I think now about 10 years ago, called From Blueprint to Scale. I think it was done by Monitor. And that really captured for me this kind of catalytic role of philanthropy coming in to actually reduce the risks for the more commercial players to step in. So today I'd like to share a couple examples of how we're doing that at Laudes. What does that look like? Specifically, as we as a foundation have been working with about 300 partners to tackle what we think is the greatest challenge of our lifetimes. Of course, the climate crisis, which continues to deepen, but also the inequality crisis, which is exacerbated by climate, but also exacerbates the climate crisis. So that's what I like to do. Let me tell you a few words about Laudes, because not everyone may know who we are. We are a bit of a new kid on the block. I think, as Max has said, we were born of a very entrepreneurial family, one that has been taking risks, that has been innovating, that has been creative for over 6 generations, really working to make business a force for good. This is the Brenninkmeijer family, who are the founders and active owners of the C&A fashion chain. And I think what's important to note is that for this family, they have been in philanthropy since 1841, since when the founders of C&A, Clemens and August, included donations to the poor as part of their books in their first accounts. So philanthropy is in their DNA. And for me, this entrepreneurial heritage really matters, because that means, you know, Laudes is really sitting within a broader enterprise that brings that kind of, you know, creative and innovative approach to business that effectively is needed if we're going to change the world. I mean, what Laudes is trying to do is harness this power of business and this power of the markets to really tackle these crises that we're in. And how we do that, and I learned from Jyoti's presentation, I used to think we did PPPs. I don't think we do PPPs because they're a little bit more, you know, complex and, you know, regimented. But what we do try to do is use our flexible philanthropic capital to bring, you know, as I always say, unlikely allies together from the private sector, the public sector, from civil society. Working across various SDGs, you know, everything we do touching business is really trying to, you know, push for more inclusive economic growth, reduce inequality, tackle the climate crisis, bring more collaboration across different groups and diverse stakeholders. So we are now in our 2nd year of activities, and we probably donate about 70 million a year. To this year is about 125 partnerships who effectively are trying to change the mindsets, the rules, and the power dynamics of this system. And I think what's important to note is anyone who works in systems change, first of all, knows how hard it is, how complex it is, and how you need to have a holistic view to it. But I think what's really important to note is that our job is getting harder. And I say that because of this multi-crisis situation, Max, I think you said at the very beginning. And I want to share one thing. I have a single slide that I think is important to share. Let's see if that works. Can you guys see that? So I love this slide because this slide actually tells me why we do what we do. This is the failure of our current system in a single chart. And what it does is it actually plots where countries are according to the extent to which we meet social thresholds and the extent to which we stay within biophysical planetary boundaries. And as you can see, and this is not a surprise, there is a tension. The more you invest and actually deliver on things like education levels, equitable access to energy, you know, social services, equality, the more you use the environmental resources that feeds that. And we need to be in the upper left-hand corner, which means we are surpassing these social thresholds, but at the same time minimizing our pull on planetary boundaries. And no one is there. And it's not surprising to see, you know, the rich countries on the far right, who of course score very high on social, but very low on the biophysical. And to me, this actually shows the challenge that we're facing. Because there is a tension. And this is where I think PPPs get really interesting, because then you start to see where the real priorities are. So let me talk a little bit about what we're doing to try to, I guess, create these types of collaborations. And I just want to give 2 examples. The first example is one that is quite exciting and fresh in my mind, because I'm here in Amsterdam right now because we just celebrated our 1st year anniversary of this initiative. It's called Built by Nature. And what Built by Nature is effectively a platform, a network, a movement to try to completely change the way we design and think about the buildings that we live and work in. Now, why is this important? Because the built environment, as you probably know, contributes almost 40% of emissions. That's because of the steel and the concrete that goes into the built environment. And so that's an issue. But there's solutions, and there's solutions which might sound crazy, like wooden buildings. Well, actually, they're not crazy, because when buildings were first built ever, wood was usually the material that we use as the oldest building material out there. And it actually has a lot of benefits of bringing wood into buildings, but it's really hard to do. So Built by Nature is really trying to bring wood and more bio-based materials into buildings. That will enable it to address what's called the embodied carbon issue with the built environment, and essentially create a carbon sink. So that's very exciting, but it's hard. Why is it hard? Because the built environment is really fragmented. There's many different actors, from the investors to the insurance companies, to the municipalities, the property developments, the architects, to the tenants, to the communities, et cetera, et cetera. A lot of different actors not talking to each other. There aren't incentives in place. In fact, there's disincentives. There's outdated building codes that actually say things like wood is very dangerous and, can burn. Well, yes, wood can burn, but if you're talking about CLT, it doesn't necessarily burn. In fact, CLT can even be more fire resistant than steel, et cetera, et cetera. So there's all these different challenges. And this, to me, is where I think philanthropy can play a role. And we did play a role. And what we did is we set this thing up and we said, this makes sense. We think there's a market opportunity to bring more bio-based materials into buildings. It's going to have a great climate impact. It'll have a great social equity impact as well. But we need to connect the dots. So we put some significant funding up front to create this entity, to connect the dots. And in doing so, connected 25 companies across Europe, who we call front runners, who are really showing how this can be done. And they're sharing best practice, they're learning from each other. We also set up a small grant budget, which is actually funding different initiatives, innovations, new ideas, crazy ideas, around the space, to test whether there's different models we can look at. And we're engaging with the financiers and the insurance companies to try to bring them along, as well as the local governments and the national governments. So it is truly an example where I think philanthropy comes in and tries to connect all these players around a common goal, which is we need to rapidly decarbonize our buildings and do it in a way that's fair and just to the communities impacted. So that's example number one. Please check it out if you're in Amsterdam. It's a great team and they're young and just getting going. The second example is one that maybe a few of you might know a little bit better, and this is Fashion for Good. This is something that we had set up when we were still CNA Foundation. We set it up about 6 years ago. And this was set up to address what we saw as a big white elephant in the fact that, the global fashion industry is not sustainable. In fact, all the initiatives to try to make it sustainable are really, I wouldn't say greenwashing, but there's a lot of pilots popping up all over the place, but not true change that can actually transform the system. In fact, the changes we were seeing were more trying to optimize the fashion industry given the current structure, as opposed to transform it into one that is truly restorative and regenerative. And so the whole idea of setting up Fashion for Good is that we need a new model, and that model needs innovation. And innovation is something that's really hard to do collaboratively, because when you think about fashion, think about the big footwear leaders like Adidas and Nike. Innovation is core to their competitive edge. So how can you get them to sit in a room and share their secrets about, sort of plant-based leathers, as an example? So the whole core of this is, let's flip that on its head. Let's actually get, key brands and retailers in a room, link them to innovators, get them to collaborate on how they test these innovations in their supply chain, unlock some finance, so the financiers come in, work with the policymakers to make sure there's more incentives for embracing these types of innovations, and actually work with them, hold their hands until they scale these innovations. So that was the idea. Is it a PPP? Well, it connects the dots. Again, I think that's what philanthropy can do very well, and also creates, I think, an expert resource on innovation in fashion that can inform things like the EU textiles strategy, or the various initiatives around mandatory human rights due diligence and the corporate sustainability directive. So that's very exciting. And I think what's key to note here is we're now 6 years in. Fashion for Good just celebrated its first 5-year anniversary. In that time, it has basically brought on board 22 corporate partners that represent 12% of the fashion industry. It has unlocked about 600 million euros in investment in innovators. It's worked with about 150 innovators, and it's on track to start to scale up some of these pilots. Is it perfect? No, it's not perfect. And you would even say, if you look at where these pilots are in the scaling, they're not mainstream. They're really far from being mainstream. And what would make them mainstream is if policymakers would come in and actually make it more expensive to do business as usual. You know, if you start to put a carbon tax on, say, a polyester t-shirt, suddenly it becomes very expensive to continue using polyester as a fiber. So there is a really important role for policymakers, and that's where I would see, looking forward, how something like this platform would be able to hopefully get the change that we want to see. So let me stop with a couple reflections, because when I think about these two examples, for me, there's a couple lessons that I've had and my team's had as a philanthropic funder. And lesson number one is, you do got to stick your neck out. That's why I started with my own personal story of risk, because, you know, you have to say, I'm going to build it and I hope they will come. And usually they will come, but sometimes they won't. Fashion for Good could have failed. And that would have been, you know, the nice thing about philanthropy, you can fail and you just say you learn and you move on. So you don't go out of business because you're not in business. But still, you know, you do need to take a risk and put some significant investment down. That's number one. I think also number two for us, you need to make it easy to bring people together. And I think one reason why Fashion for Good actually really took off in the early days is it was pretty cool. It was in a cool building. It's still in that building. You know, it's quite sexy. It was a good part of Amsterdam. People wanted to be there. I actually talked to some of the initial brands that joined, and they said, it's, you know, we came because of the building, which sounds very shallow, but the building was pretty cool, you know? So I think these are things that, you know, you need to think about. What is it going to bring people in a room and get them to come together physically? I think thirdly, you really need to understand the barriers to change. And with Built by Nature, we spent a lot of time trying to understand, why is it that wood-based, you know, mass timber and bio-based buildings are not getting to mainstream? They're on the agenda, yes, and there's more and more enthusiasm, but why is that? And we did actually lots of 5 why exercises digging into what are the really more deeply rooted systemic issues, and what can we do as philanthropy to try to reduce that risk. So that's probably not rocket science, but I think for us, it was really important to actually understand where we could play as philanthropy and maybe where we shouldn't play. And that is the ultimate question, because when I know we'll be spending some time in groups talking about what is the role of philanthropy in PPPs. Well, I personally feel that philanthropy plays a catalytic role, but it can't play a scaling role. It just doesn't have the resources. I mean, I think Benjamin said it as well. I mean, it is not big enough to scale things with the amount of funding that is there for philanthropy. It needs to be smartly catalytic and actually focus on those levers that we think can ultimately get others to step up. So with that, let me stop. But I hope that was helpful to share a little bit of our story.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Leslie. Very powerful, very inspiring. And I think your last point really important also for all of us to understand where philanthropy can sit in all this. Now, just one question to follow up on this to you. Since we are now building this Philanthropy in PPPs forum, and I think we all sense there is probably a slightly different understanding for PPPs, as you just put it yourself. What is your hope for this forum to develop a meaningful intersection between these two communities?
Yeah, it was a great question, because as I said in the beginning, I didn't know the forum even existed. So, well, congratulations for existing, because I think it's a really useful platform. I mean, my hope is that this forum can really be the knowledge hub for best practice around PPPs, around how philanthropy engages in PPPs and strengthens them, specifically highlighting the failures. Because I think that there's a lot, let me say this another way. Philanthropy is very good about talking about what works. It's very bad about talking about what fails. And where this forum could be really helpful, it's share with us the doozies, you know, the big projects everyone will really pinned all their hopes on that actually failed miserably, and what did we learn from it? Because I suspect there's probably a lot of lessons that keep being made again and again and again, because this type of information is not out there. So would hope that that's out there. And I think that would be really, really valuable to many of the foundations that we partner with, including ourselves.
Fantastic. Thank you, Leslie. So we'll try our very best to live up to this. Thank you very much for having joined us and inspiring us for this future work. It seems to be very relevant, very important, and glad to do this all together here. Now,
Thank you.
Since we are running a little bit over time, but we want to close at 4 o'clock, I just want to change a little bit the format as we at least have prepared it. For you, it doesn't really change much, but we will send you now one more time into breakouts, because I think there was a lot that we had to take in now. And it's good to have, again, the possibility to discuss this in smaller groups. Only 10 minutes. That leaves us with 5 minutes to wrap up. I invite you to use the Google Doc that I put in the chat for every one of you, just to pull down some ideas that you have picked up here in these conversations, so that we can use them and build on in the follow-up of the session. So the question that you can discuss in the breakout is, where do you see the PPP opportunities in philanthropy? And I think we heard a lot that stimulates this debate. Jean-Christophe, can you please send us off? Thank you. First of all, I would say big thank you to all of you for joining and sharing your ideas and staying with us until the end here. This is amazing. We will be in touch with you. There are a few more things in the pipeline. So we would like to launch a mapping exercise for this intersection between philanthropy and public-private partnerships at global level. So we have a better understanding what's already out there, how does it work, where are the opportunities, the barriers, and where is literally this territory that still needs to be developed.
I must admit, it's been a very interesting meeting. However, I have additional questions about risk allocation, about basic institutional structure, etc., etc. Are you going to follow up?
Yes, Alina, we will definitely follow up on this. So that's what I just wanted to say, that we will have, the mapping exercise will probably take around 6 months, but we want to have every quarter a session dedicated to this topic, and ideally bringing in people from the field who have the experience and can share that and inspire us. And this is also the moment where we can dive a little bit deeper into these specific questions. I'm fully aware that there were lots of questions and new ideas today, but it's not the moment in these 1.5 hours.
Yeah, I know. Yeah. However, I must say that I'd like to see a case study.
Yeah, good. Yeah, no, that's exactly what we will collect and share with all of you. And I would like to ask you to fill in the survey, because that helps us to see a bit what the expectations are. I'm talking to everyone here now, and also what you can bring to this community. And if there's any one of you who would like to spend a little bit more time in thinking through with us how we can build this up and shape this, please let us know in the follow-up to this session, so that we can connect and explore how to do this best. Jean-Christophe, is there anything else from your side?
So yes, of course, Max will be following up with those who have let him know with Max at WAPPP.org that they're interested in collaborating and being a part of this Philanthropy and PPPs forum initiative. We will be also strengthening and building a leadership team around that, so that we can actually put the horsepower on the road afterwards. And WAPPP is doing a lot of other things in PPPs bound to certain regions or certain asset classes. And we invite you to simply follow WAPPP's NGO activity. We have this Twitter channel, we have a LinkedIn presence, we have the YouTube channel where this recording will also be available, I believe, as of tomorrow, if I'm able to do the trimming later today. And yeah, it was a big pleasure to be part of this kickoff. Thank you so much, Max, for this wonderful preparation. And it was super engaging. I'm smiling, so I think it was excellent.
Fantastic. Thank you all. Have a nice rest of the week, and looking very much forward to be in touch to build this together. All the best to you. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.